So
I feel like in this case might be a bit more serious because so you slaughtered the animal, and so can this person who you'd like to invite to your house actually eat it?
I think that's true, but I don't necessarily think it's more serious. Like I think it's, I think there are examples that extreme that happen nowadays. But yeah, I mean, this is a really, like, when we talk about trafe here, right, you can't actually have trafe, like dairy products, right, because trafe by definition refers to meat, right, so this is like, it's actually trafe or not actually trafe, I agree. But Rabbi Zera does what the local custom dictates, the local custom being in Israel, and the Gemara says, well, how could he do that? Like, aren't you supposed to pick the stricter of the two, right, coming back to that question, which are you supposed to do, right, and they say, well, two things. Right? First of all, it depends on whether you plan to travel back. So if you're in a place and you're visiting, right? You're there for the Chag, so you have to keep the stricter position of the place you left. But if you have moved to a place, in for a penny, in for a pound, right? You're there to stay. So you're there, you have to adopt their customs. In addition, the Gemara goes on to say that Israel's customs are given a higher weight. And we probably won't talk about that so much tonight, but that's an interesting idea that certain places' customs, particularly the land of Israel, have a higher weight. But this idea that you've left a place behind, right? There's a difference between visiting a place and living in a place. And I'll tell you like one modern application in which this is cited a lot. Let's say you go to Israel for Pesach. You want to go to Israel for Pesach? Good plan. So let's say you go to Israel for Pesach. So how many days of Pesach should you observe?
8, because you're from the diaspora.
Okay, maybe 8 because you're from the diaspora. And what would be the reasoning in the language of this Gemara?
Because you're only there temporarily.
You're there temporarily and you're going back, right? You have to accept the strictures of the place from where you came because you have to take the stricter position. But arguably you have to do it in private, right? There are people, my home rabbi among them, one of my home rabbis among them, who would say like those big second day Chag shul things that happen in like the big American hotels, right? That's not okay. If you're going to keep that last day of Chag, you should be davening in your room quietly by yourself, right? You're not supposed to accept people. Like it's Israel. They only keep 7 days. Hello, people, right? Stay out of the hallways of the hotel. Anyway, that's like one position, right? The other position would say, no, you're in Israel, right? Israel's sort of higher standards overrule that rule of the place where you're coming from, and so you should really do that. And so these are the factors that kind of get discussed in all instances of changing a minhag, what to do when conflicting minhagim come up, right? Both the factor of, what's the practice in the place where you come from. It's very place-focused, right? That's for sure true. And what do you do when you go to a new place? It depends whether you're going back to the place you came from, or whether you're staying in the place that you've gone to. And this is really, it's sort of brought down across the board in terms of the codes, in terms of the law codes. But if you look at source number 3, the Shulchan Aruch adds some additional factors that the Gemara doesn't bring up, some of what you alluded to, Ellen, but yeah, David.
So does the origin of the minhag have an impact on this? It doesn't sound like they're discussing that, but for the case of multiple days
No, so that's what I'm saying. The origin of the minhag is not discussed here, but look at the Shulchan Aruch, because he does talk about that. Right? Here it just seems like the only thing we know about where the minhag came from is that it's place-based. Right? It's not I woke up in the morning and decided that this is my custom. Which, in case you're wondering if that has ever happened, 100%. 100% people wake up in the morning and decide they have a custom. Just putting that out there, right? But that is not this. Yeah.
But isn't the 2 days versus 1 day, that's not a minhag, that's a halach?
Later on in the year, I'll teach a class about the 2 days versus 1 day. But all I'll say is that that's like what you just said is like perfect, right? Because it's really hard sometimes to say, is that the minhag about how we keep the law, or is that the law, right? Like if you come to me and you say, well, this isn't kosher, right? That's the law. So I'll say, no. Like the custom in your community is to treat that as non-kosher. The custom in our community is to treat it as kosher, right? Who's right? It's hard to say. But look at the Shulchan Aruch because he does address more about the source of the custom. And this is all, by the way, background for getting to the point of being able to address these questions of who's right and who's wrong when you're arguing with your spouse, roommate, shul board. Yes. Okay, so source number 3, things that are permitted, and you know it's permitted, but you treat it as prohibited. everyone, I want to ask you to shout out, but think to yourself of a case where this might be true. Okay, you know it's really okay, but you, your family, your community, somebody you know treats it as though it's not okay, right? Meaning you don't do it, you treat it as a prohibition. So then it's as if they took it upon themselves as a vow, and it's forbidden to permit it to them. Okay, they're not allowed to do it because they know it's really okay, but they've decided not to do it. Okay, it's their minhag, you could say, to treat it as prohibited, but they went into that eyes wide open. Okay, so he gives some examples. Fine, I'm skipping that. If you want it to behave that way forever, then it counts as a vow. Okay, I'm skipping a little bit. Therefore, one who wishes to have this custom with certain things that are permitted, as a fence against doing the wrong things or for the sake of asceticism, should say from the beginning that he's not taking it upon himself as a vow. Okay, if you want to ever be able to get out of it easily, you should specify that you just want to do this for a while. But those who are accustomed to act as though permitted things are prohibited because they believe that they really are forbidden, this is not like a vow. And there are those who say that if someone makes, okay, I'm going to skip that part, right? But it's not binding on you. Okay, this is a little bit related to what you were saying, Ellen. This is what we sometimes call a minhag ta'ud. Okay, you think that something is not allowed, and so you've behaved your whole life as though this is not allowed. So is it now your custom to not do that thing? Shulchan Aruch says no. That's not a custom. We call that a mistake, right? That's different, right? They are qualitatively different. Okay? Just having thought that something was a certain way, that does not qualify that as your family's custom. Right? And presumably this would extend beyond individuals, right? If your town decided that X was prohibited, and it turns out you were just wrong, right? You knew it was okay, but you had this reason for deciding, whatever, right? No, you were wrong, right? And you have realized the error of your ways, so that's not a custom anymore, right? It never was a custom, right? It was a minhag ta'ud, it was a mistake all along, and you can get out of that just by saying, I've seen the light. And then in the second part there, he says the acceptance of the majority applies to those who accepted it and to their descendants, and even things which the city did not formally agree upon, but rather each one took on their custom in order to create a fence for the Torah, right? So customs that develop in a community, even if it's not necessarily the case that, there was like a formal announcement from the pulpit that we're all going to do this. And anyone who comes from outside the city to live there becomes like the people of the city and has to behave in accordance with their decrees. It's funny, who mentioned this before? I can't remember, right? But it's funny that the Shulchan Aruch says this, that if you come to a place, you have to behave that way. Because the Shulchan Aruch, one of the reasons that some people hated the Shulchan Aruch is because he kind of did away with local custom to some degree, right? Once you put everybody, like all the customs in one book, and you sort of spread that book far enough around, right? So the modern version of Jewish law is actually we've taken like a custom from here, and a custom from here, and a custom from here. And by custom in this case I mean a way of enacting a halakha, right? A way of enacting a law. But our ways of enacting laws, right, come from all different places, in part because the Shulchan Aruch did that. Okay, that's all the background you need about minhag. That's all the language that you need about minhag to go into the nitty-gritty. Okay, so now you get married. You get married to another person. You get married to a shul. We call that membership, right? You get married to a community because you've moved there and you're stuck there for a while, right? So in some way, shape, or form, you get married. And it turns out that you and the person/people you have married do not share customs. But your customs go way, way back. Maybe it's the custom of the place where you came from. Maybe it's your family's custom. Maybe your bubby told you about it. And ditto for the other person. Okay? You're like in the same boat. You have like equal, like sort of yichus, right? Like lineage in terms of your minhagim. Right? We're going to say that everyone's on the same level playing field. So here's a responsive from the Igrat Moshe, from Moshe Feinstein. I think it's important to keep in mind when these people were writing because you're going to see a real change over the course of time. So Rav Moshe died in 1986, and he lived much of his life in America. And here's what he has to say. And I think, Alex, you were the one who brought up like things having changed over time in terms of how minhag is. So he talks about that. So he says, the question is about a man and a woman who come from different places, and they are getting married, and they want to know whose customs to follow. So he says, okay, they're from different places. Veniso Zelazo, in New York. They've gotten married in New York. Okay, like the epitome of the American melting pot, that's where they're getting married. Shahaminhagim adayin chalukim, where minhagim are still different from one another. Right? right? There's like, he says it's like 2 courts in one city. I would argue it's more like 50 courts in one city. Right? You have like little pockets, and I'm sure this is true of Chicago also, right? Like you have like, these people do this thing, these people do this thing. Later on he says everyone continues to behave just like they did in Europe. Not so much anymore, I feel, but could have been true at the time when he was writing, right? So you had the shtiebel of people from here and the shtiebel of people from here. Right, fine. So what are they supposed to do, these 2 people who got married and are living in New York, right? Because they haven't gone back to Europe, right? They haven't moved to his community in Europe, they haven't moved to her community in Europe. They're living in New York where both of their customs are alive and well. So he asked the question, right, should he take her customs or should she take his customs? What should they do? So he thinks about it a while, and he says, he says a woman has to take on her husband's customs, whether her husband's customs are stricter or more lenient. So raise your hand if you've ever heard this position before.
I have heard it. And I have a big problem.
Okay, we can talk about the problems in a sec. Okay, so some people have heard it. So this is usually, like when I'm teaching people who are getting married, which I do a lot, this is usually what I hear, right? And like, in fact, when I was engaged to my husband, who is from a German family, and they only wait 3 hours between meat and milk, like that was like the first thing that many of my friends had to say, like, good job. Right? Like, he only waits 3 hours, way to go. But don't worry, the plot will thicken. So Rav Moshe has some reasons. He has some reasons why she should change her minhag. And keep in mind that he has to justify 2 things, really. One thing he has to justify is why she should change her minhag and not him. But the other kind of lurking piece, which you'll see more in some of the other tshuvot, is the whole idea that someone should change their minhag at all is not so clear. Right? Because what are the conditions under which you change your minhag? If you go to a new town and you're not going back. Okay? But like you need a real reason to change your minhag, because your minhag is your minhag. And it's not just like negotiating matters of law, it's a big deal to change minhag. That's kind of the baggage that everyone's going into this conversation with. So here are his reasons. First of all, he says, when a man and a woman get married, she has gone into his reshut, his domain. Is that a good translation? Yeah. Right? She has moved to his place. That's his definition of marriage. And he has this proof from the Gemara in Ketubot, from a piece of Talmud which I quoted for you. Sorry, there's so many pages, I promise not to read them all. He quotes this piece of Talmud, it's source number 2 in part 2. And I'm sorry I didn't number the pages. Don't worry, we'll get to it eventually. But the Gemara in Ketubot says that a woman's always in her father's domain until she enters her husband's domain for marriage. Okay, that's all you really need to know. So Moshe says, see, a woman who gets married is in her husband's domain, not her father's domain. And he actually goes through another class that I teach, which I think is another interesting question, more specifically about marriage. He talks about how a woman's obligations to her parents change once she's married, if they change, right? But he argues that they do change. She's sort of less obligated to her parents because she is in her husband's domain and she can't leave. She has to stay with her husband. Wherever he is, that's where she has to be. That's Rav Moshe's argument number 1. Number 2, he says, or really number 2 is an extension of number 1, there is no greater moving from one place to another than marriage. Marriage is the ultimate move. Okay? You have left the place right wherever you were, and however far from your home you have moved in marrying, you have moved to a completely new place, Rav Moshe says. Right? I'm sure you could take this all sorts of ways psychologically. Right? But he says you've moved to a completely new place when you get married, and there's no going back. And then he says, in summary, so since we here in New York, everyone keeps their custom from Europe, so you've gotten married, you've moved. Who's moved? She's moved, right? She's moved to his place. And that's his argument. And this, by the way, was, in case you missed it in the English, this was written in 1954. Okay? She's moved to his place, and so she has to take on his customs. And he doesn't seem to feel so bad about her taking on her husband's customs because, leaving behind her customs because she's totally in this category of having moved to another place. But Rav Moshe has a qualifying tshuva also. And this one comes back also to the original definition of minhag that we started with. Because we said that minhag is place-based or maybe family-based. But like I said, it's not you waking up in the morning and deciding that you have a custom. Okay? So Rav Moshe elsewhere, this tshuva was written earlier, I think in the 1930s. Elsewhere, Rav Moshe addresses the question of whether a woman has to shave her head when she gets married. Okay, we'll leave that detail aside. And wear a wig, which which is like a big hullabaloo whether you can wear a wig or not, whether you should wear a wig or not. So Rav Moshe says, okay, so you know that time, you know how I've written before about how like a woman, when she gets married, she has to change her minhag, she has to do her husband. Her husband cannot decide that he has a minhag to wear a wig, right? That's not a thing, right? It can't be, right? That's not.
It's not his minhag for his wife to wear a wig? Is that what
Right,
you're saying?
unless, arguably he's had a wife before, but probably not even that. Right? He says, "Hina v'dzai ikav pilut bein chumrat minhag kavua be'ezeh makom, chumrat shehabal rotzeh lahachmir alav." Right? He decides that his personal stringency is to wear a wig. Right? It's not the case that where he lives, everyone wears a wig, because again, Rav Moshe is now dealing with a New York-based reality. But this guy has decided, right? His custom is, right, that his wife should wear a wig. Right? That's what he wants his family custom to be. And that, Rav Moshe says, cannot apply. It doesn't apply to his wife. A custom that applies, also to a spouse is like a place-based where the community has ruled X. But the husband saying, like, my personal minhag is this, and so I want your personal minhag to also be this, that Rav Moshe says doesn't count. Right? And I think this is important because even if you don't like Rav Moshe's reasoning, right, at least he stays true to it. Right? Marriage is about moving from one place to another. You have entirely moved your location and you are not going back. But you've moved your location. That doesn't mean, right, the person is not like their own location. Right? You've just moved to their place. So the minhag that your husband decides that he has, right, that he personally enacts, that is not a custom that's binding on the spouse as well. And then she's free to have her own customs. That's his position on wigs and about communal versus individual customs. Those are his reasons. But yes.
It's imposing it on somebody else.
Yeah. It depends who you ask. Meaning,
So like
for some
if she
people it's
didn't wear a
reducing.
wig, she'd have uncovered hair that she walked around.
Oh no, this is not a conversation about uncovering your hair. It's a conversation about wearing a wig.
As opposed to a hat.
Sure, let's say. Right, as opposed to some other way of covering your hair, but specifically shaving your head and wearing a wig, which is a very, was and is very sort of a communal marker, right? Some people do, and some communities do, and some communities don't have that tradition. Right? That's Rav Moshe's approach. Those are his reasons. Marriage is about moving, but you can only move to another location, right? It doesn't bind you to that person to do whatever it is that they think should be done. Look at Rav Avaji Yosef. Yeah, Alex.
Is the differentiation between him just making the decision that is his minhag, or because it's not something that he can do? Because he's not wearing a wig and she can, so he can't decide it, or the differentiation is that
he does sort of frame it that way, but I want to go on to the next shuvah, so I'm not going to get too stuck on the wig thing, but he basically says that it's not, he can't, if she's not actually moving to that place, right? So if it's something that he was practicing, you could say it comes with him from his place. But if it's not something that he was practicing, it didn't come with him from his place.
even if everyone from his place did that.
Because the assumption is that he's not now living in a place where everybody does that. Because he's living in New York, where not everybody does anything.
Okay, so it's not necessarily because it's something that a woman can do there.
I don't think so. Meaning there is a little bit of that in the Tshuva, but I don't think that's like the focus of his argument.
Is New York an undifferentiated place? Or is Williamsburg the same as New York, and Borough Park the same as New York or Lower East Side? I mean,
Yeah, I
because
think so.
New Square, it might be that everybody does certain things, and in Muncie, everybody does something different.
So it's really interesting, and I'm not gonna spend time on that now, but it's interesting that he seems to, like, his categorization of place in America seems to go by state or like region, right? Like he doesn't say, well, the minhag in, like, on the Upper West Side, right, is this way, right? He doesn't seem willing to go that far. I don't know if that's because he assumes that every place is heterogeneous to some degree, or because he feels like you should think of it, right, like, the Polish custom, the German custom, the New York custom, right? I'm not sure which is the motivating factor. But it's true, he doesn't make those distinctions. Look quickly at the next source, number 1, in part 2. This is from Rav Avaji Yosef. he just died this past year. Former Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel. So a little bit more contemporary. And I'm going to give you the quick summary. But first of all, it's just interesting to note that a lot of the questions that Rabbanit gets are about Ashkenazic women who marry Sephardi men. And what's the question if you marry a Sephardi man? There's only one question. What? No.
Can you eat rice?
Bigger fish to fry. Yeah, rice on Pesach, right? That's really all there is to know. Can you or can't you? So it's just interesting, right? Rabbi Yosef, who's a proud Sephardi Jew, it's nuanced, but he definitely has a different reaction to, right, the Ashkenazi woman marrying the Sephardi man. It's kind of like she's married up, right? The Sephardi woman marrying the Ashkenazi man, he's like a little less sympathetic, but this basically remains his reasoning throughout. So he says also, like Rav Moshe, that she should adopt her husband's customs across the board. Okay? And here are his reasons. So I won't even go into all of them, though they're all really interesting. So he says, first of all, you absolutely can't have them practicing differently. Okay, that's number one. And this is what allows him to reject the idea that they should preserve their own customs, which he does spend a while dwelling on. Rav Ovadia is a very prolific writer. This is like several pages, and it's highly excerpted. So he writes at length about sort of the difficulty of having someone ever give up their minhag. But why is he willing to let anyone ever give up their minhag? Because of Shalom Beit, he literally uses that phrase that you used earlier. And another phrase that he uses, you can't have two people who are chalokim b'isatan, literally divided in their dough. You can't have two people eating at the same table where she's like, your food isn't kosher, and he's like, your food isn't kosher. It's like not a recipe for success in a marriage, according to Rav Ovadia. Also in a community, probably, right? It's just that's not a way to be married to someone. So he says, you for sure can't have that, so somebody's got to change, right? And why does she have to change? She has to change, according to Rav Ovadia Yosef, for a few reasons. First of all, he says that 100% a woman who gets married, it's as though she went to his place. That's definitely true. And he also says we have a concept called ishto kugufo, that how's that going to go in English? A man's wife is like his body. Okay, she is as himself to him. Right? Rav Ovadia says this. And this is like a famous phrase, ishto kugufo. People quote it all the time. Google it when you get home. Okay? Ishto kugufo, and so she has to do what he does. In addition, Rav Ovadia says, this you're also going to love, I think, right? Maybe it's not so bad that she's giving up her customs, because she probably never really accepted her customs, like fully accepted them anyway, because she always knew that one day she was going to get married. She always hoped that one day she would get married, and she knew that at that point she would give up her customs. So it's kind of like, even though she's been practicing this way her whole life, she never really accepted those customs. And so she was always totally willing, like she always sort of had that in mind, right, that she might give up those customs and kind of move on with her life. So she's moved to a different place. She, ishto kugufo, she is like his own self. He also raises this idea from a verse in the Torah, which we might not have time to talk about, a verse in the Bible rather, Nikivata sovav gever, that a woman should encircle a man. He sort of plays with different phrases about marriage that come up in different places in rabbinic literature, and says for all these reasons, she should change her practice to match his. Now, if we had more time, but this can be homework for you, if you turn the page after Rav Ovadia, so you'll see that the sources that follow, the next few sources, are the sources that Rav Moshe quotes and the sources that Rav Ovadia quotes. I think what's so great about researching something that applies equally to modern times is that you get to read these tshuvot. I mean, you can really read tshuvot that are not modern also. You get to read response literature, right? And what I learned from reading these tshuvot is that one of the keys to a successful responsa is to cite a lot of sources and to do so very authoritatively, right? Because, and especially Rav Ovadia has this down, because he cites a lot of sources, and it's very unlikely you're going to go look up all his sources because it would take a really, really long time, right? And that might sound cynical, and it might be a little cynical, but it really is true, right? Meaning these writers are really masters of a broad corpus of halachic literature, and they know how to bring these arguments to bear. But if you read the source text, right, the original text that they're quoting from, you might not interpret them the same way. And so the final tshuva that I brought for you is from Rabbanit, and I think I'll just spend time reading that instead of going through the sources that he draws on. So Rabbanit is the most modern of these modern sources. Rabbanit is, he should live really well, I think actually not as well as he was, but he's still alive in Jerusalem now. And Rabbanit basically does what you or I might not have done, which is that he looks up, or he knows all the sources that Rav Ovadia and Moshe are quoting. And he basically says, like, you've constructed a really plausible case, okay? So in order for you to be able to change your custom, you need to have moved from point A to point B. And we can all agree that marriage is like moving from point A to point B. Right? And then you've given us all these arguments why it should be the woman to change her custom. Right? But maybe it shouldn't be. Anyone have a plausible argument why maybe it shouldn't be the woman who should change her custom? Marilyn's wanted to say this for a long time.
She may be more committed than he is.
Okay, but so what?
And also, Dr. Kanzler brought up something. We're talking about an Ashkenazi woman marrying a Sephardi man. When they have the Seder, they want to be able to invite both families. If they have kidneyot, then they can't invite her family because they want to come.
Why not?
Oh, I wouldn't come
Why not?
because they don't eat kidneyot.
You don't have to eat
You
anything.
don't have to eat the kidney though.
It's not treif.
It's not even not kosher for Pesach. It's just kidney.
Would it make your
What is
dishes?
Nope, it's totally fine.
I still wouldn't feel comfortable.
So that's a great test case, right? Because at that point, right, you would say, well, gosh, we really need a uniform custom, right? Because if you won't eat off of my dishes because I put rice on them, right? So that sort of, forces me into a position where I feel like, well, then we have to get rid of the rice, right? If you're not going to come, if I don't, take away the rice, right? Or them, right? It's me or them, right? And for sure, some of these conversations about Minhag get to that point, right? But it's interesting. It doesn't seem to matter who's more committed to their custom. It may matter whether, right, can you have a custom if you've never practiced it, right? That might sort of tie into it, right? Like, let's say you come from a family whose, practice is X, but you yourself are a non-practicing Jew. Is that your family's custom, or